G'day and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, I want to show you how to make it easier to bend over and touch your toes. And we're going to do that in the form of 4 mobility exercises. Now there's definitely some strength and stability aspects to being able to bend over and touch your toes. We can cover that in another video if you guys are up for it. But what we want to go through here is we want to go through 4 specific exercises that target some of the hidden and not so hidden features that restrict you from being able to bend over and touch your toes. Now, one of the points I wanted to make about this video is that when bending over to touch your toes, a lot of people feel like we tend to lose that capacity based on age. That as you get older, bending over to touch your toes becomes harder because we get older. Now, the reality is for a lot of people that it does become harder to bend over and touch your toes as you get older. But the point I wanted to make with this is that it's not because you're getting older that it's getting harder to bend over and touch your toes. What I find clinically is that it's more likely that there's other day-to-day capacities that we're losing that then compound together to make it harder to bend over and touch your toes. And the longer you're alive, the bigger those issues become and the more problematic it becomes of bending over and touching your toes. So hopefully by the end of this video, you'll have a really clear understanding that there are some reversible and some changeable factors to make it immediately easier for you to bend over and touch your toes in a very short amount of time. So before we get to that, obviously, if you can let me know down in the comments how you find these exercises, let me know which one you end up finding is the best one for you. And if you go on to enjoy the video, please consider leaving a like rating down below and subscribe to the channel if you're new. It's free. You can obviously unsubscribe later if this content isn't for you. But what I want to make sure that we get across here is that there are some controllable, tangible things that you can change in a very short amount of time to make it easy for you to bend down and touch your toes. Now, before we get to those 4 exercises, what I really want to make sure that you do throughout this video is we need a specific test or pre-test to get a sense of how you are to begin with. And we're going to retest that test after each exercise so that you can decipher which one is the best for you and that you can see how impactful these exercises can be. And for me, the best way to do this is obviously to bend down and touch your toes. So we want to make sure that this is as specific and controlled as possible so that you can repeat it consistently. So we want to make sure that your feet are about shoulder width apart. We want to make sure that your knees stay straight, and we're just bending from your hips and your low back to get down to the ground. And a great way to do this is just slide your hands down the front of your legs until you get to a point where you can't go any further. So I'm obviously fortunate I can just get my palms to touch the ground. But the point of this test isn't necessarily how far you go, although you do want to take note of that so that you can see a change going forwards. But it's also how it feels to do. So take note of where you feel tight, how tight it feels, and obviously how far you go. And then repeat this after each exercise. So the first thing we're going to do basically is we're going to do an exercise that probably seems a little bit strange for this particular video. And we're going to take a lacrosse ball or a tennis ball, but a lacrosse ball is a bit better. And we're going to stand up and dig this into the sole of your foot, more specifically the heel. Now, this seems a little bit strange because bending over and touching your toes doesn't really use a lot of ankle flexibility, if any at all. But what we do find is there's a lot of soft tissue and connective tissue, whether it's fascia, whether it's neural tissue, whatever it might be, they can get glued down and banded down because we wear shoes and socks a lot. It creates this sort of laminate effect where the tissue underneath that heel can get compressed with heat, becomes a bit tackier, a bit more restricted than it should. And we need that tissue to be able to floss and give as we're bending over. And for a lot of people, a restriction down here at the heel can actually stop you from bending as far forward as you could. So what we want to do here is obviously do your pre-test beforehand. And all we need you to do basically is place the ball underneath your heel. And what we're doing here is we're going to try and grind any tightness or restriction that you find and try and free up some of this tissue. So go towards sort of the front aspect of the heel, make sure there's no bug on you. Move it towards the back aspect of the heel, to the outside of the heel, the inside of the heel. The inside of the heel can potentially be one of the more tender areas, so just be gentle, but just grind away as best as you feel comfortable. Compare it to both sides, see how it feels on both sides. One side generally feels a little bit tighter and tender for a lot of people, and there is a specific reason for that, which we can get to down the track potentially. But essentially we're just trying to find some tightness, get rid of that tightness, kicking the ball away. And then what you'll hopefully find when you do this is repeating the same position, feet straight, knees straight, sliding your hands down the front of your legs. You should then feel like you can go a little bit further. So for me, I can obviously touch the ground still, but I feel like my shoulders can get down a little bit deeper than they could before. So let me know in the comments down below how that went for you. It's often surprising at how much of an impact it has by ungluing some of that restriction from below to allow everything over the top to bend over more completely. So that's a fantastic exercise number one. The second exercise is a really, really important one because we're going to go through a sciatic nerve flossing exercise. So I've gone through it on the channel in a little bit more depth before, so I'll link that up here if you want to go into it a little bit deeper. But one of the interesting things is when you do that pre-test and you bend forward to touch your toes, if you feel any tightness at the back of the leg, specifically the back of the knee, most people are either conditioned or are led to believe that that's hamstring tightness. Now, the interesting thing is if you find that there's some tightness specifically at the back of the knee, that's actually sciatic nerve tightness, not muscular tightness. Because the hamstrings don't go through the back of the knee, the tendons basically diverge either side of the knee. There aren't a lot of sort of soft tissue structures behind the knee, one of which is that neural tension. So if you bend forward and touch your toes or try and touch your toes and you feel a lot of tightness at the back of the knee, it's actually sciatic nerve tightness that we need to floss free and free up so that you can then move better through that motion. So a great way to do this, really simple exercise, is we want to get you to lie down on your back, and I'm going to mobilize this side, so we want to let the other leg drop down out of the way. All we want to do is we want to lift that thigh up far enough that you can clasp it behind it and feel relaxed, and this position doesn't change. All we're going to do is we're going to get you to bend your foot back to increase that neural tension at the back of the leg, and then we're just going to gently straighten your leg as far as you feel comfortable and then come down again. Again, making sure that we're not changing the position of this thigh, so we're not trying to bring your thigh closer to your chest, trying to maintain that level, keep that foot bent back. And what I like to do with my patients is however far up you feel you can get, whether there's a roof or a tree in my case, just take note of where that gets to. And after about 10 or 15 of these, you should actually feel like it goes a little bit further than it did to begin with. And that's obviously a sign that you're flossing free this sciatic nerve as it passes through all the soft tissue channels that it goes through, sort of shearing some of that tissue free, giving it a better course for that nerve to run through. And then again, once you've done that 10 or 15 times, as we did before, what we need to do again is same thing, feet shoulder width apart, knees straight, bending down as far as you feel comfortable, and then again, you should feel like it's getting further and further again. So for me, my elbows are getting closer and closer to the ground. I still feel a little bit of neural tension on the left, the side that I did, but I feel a lot more still on that right-hand side. So if I can free up that neural tension a little bit more on the right-hand side, I should be able to go even further again. So again, just a reminder, if you do this movement or any movement really, and you feel some restriction at the back of the knee, that's most likely neural tension and not muscular tightness. So flossing that tissue free is going to improve the capacity of that nerve to function and also the ability for you to bend forward and touch your toes further. So just stretching the hamstrings alone, it may be a component, but it's not that specific component if that tightness is at the back of your leg. Now, the third exercise that we're going to go through moving up is going to be a hip mobility exercise. So obviously when you're standing up, bending forwards, hip flexion is what we need the most to be able to express that movement in the form of bending forward and touching your toes. And the best hip flexion stretch that I've ever seen is one that goes after the hip joint capsule in a hip flexed position. And what I mean by that is a lot of traditional muscular stretches, so if you do the lotus position or like a pigeon stretch where you're feeling that piriformis getting tight, often that's more the superficial muscular tightness that we're addressing. But if there's some deeper joint restriction where that joint's become a little bit rusty, again, most likely from sitting, all the time we spend sitting, we lose that sort of flexibility through that soft tissue, that capsule. We want to try and get an exercise in there that specifically targets the hip joint capsule and frees it up with a bias of hip flexion. And it's not as complicated as it seems, but for this exercise, the one that I like to do is the hip capsule stretch. Normally we do the banded hip capsule stretch. Again, I'll leave a link up the top so that you can find that. But in this instance, just because we're out in the middle of nowhere, we're just going to do the basic version of it without the band. But the band does amplify this a lot more if you are extra tight and rusty, extra stiff and rusty. So again, we're going to stretch this hip closest to the camera. So we want to take the other hip out the way. Now, essentially what the exercise is we're going to try and get the thigh bone to feel like it's pressing out the back side of the hip joint. The way that we do that is we want to keep our shoulders and our hips integrated together. We're not going to dump the hips down and leave the shoulders behind. We're going to keep everything together and shift your shoulders and your hips sort of parallel to the ground. until you feel like you start to get a little bit of pressure through here. So it may not be a muscular stretch like a lot of the other stretches that you'll do, but it'll feel like a gentle pressure in that area. And that's essentially the stretch. But depending on the person, before we get into that sort of lateral movement, you can gently drop down into hip flexion as far as you feel comfortable before you move off to the side. And that's going to bias that capsule in more of a hip flex position. But also, if you get down to this position and you feel it more in the groin a little bit, then obviously come out of that hip flex position because you might be impinging it a little bit. But the idea is, wherever you feel most comfortable to begin with, as this hip starts to free up, you should feel like you can gradually get down deeper and deeper and deeper, depending on how loose those tissues become. And then once we're in this position, we just want to stay here for about 30 seconds, stay here for a minute. Obviously, in the other video that I've linked above, the hip capsular stretch video, there are other positions you can put your leg into, but for the purposes of this one, we're just going to stay and bias that hip flex position to allow us to bend over the top of that hip a lot more to touch our toes. So again, once you've done that, coming back to the pre-test again, retesting everything. So again, feet shoulder width apart, knees straight, sliding ourselves down the front as far as we feel comfortable. Again, I feel like I'm closing that gap a lot more now. I don't feel as tight down this side. The right side still feels a little bit restricted. So obviously I want to make sure that I come back and do that side as well if I'm being thorough. Now, the fourth and final exercise that I want to go through is a back mobility exercise. Now I kicked my ball away, so I just have to run and grab it for a sec. Now the reason for this, and this is potentially one of the most important exercises of this set of 4, is that we're going to take a lacrosse ball or a tennis ball or a foam roller, whatever you feel you've got lying around at home. And we're going to let that ball gently press into the joints of our spine. And what I want to talk about quickly before we get to the exercise is that based on the sitting habits and the slouchy postures that we tend to get into, we can overload and ask those areas to become stiffer and tighter and more restricted than they should be, so that when we then want to bend forward and touch our toes, we're trying to do that through tissue that's become restricted and stiff. So by taking a ball, we can place the ball into the base of our spine, right in the middle. We can let it roll off to one side onto the joints. So we're not going all the way out to the side. We're starting in the middle. We're just going to let it roll slightly off to the side. So what we're going to do here is we're going to gently lie down on top of the ball, and we're going to let the ball press in. So again, we do this a lot on the channel because it's such an effective exercise at mobilizing a stiff spine. And again, much like the hip joint capsule exercise, we're not necessarily targeting the muscle tissue, even though it is going to help free up some any tight muscles in the area. We're actually going after the deeper joint stiffness in the spine. Now, the exercise itself isn't rolling around. You can move around until you feel a spot that feels a little bit restricted for you. And then we just want to stay there. We're going to let the ball specifically press into those individual joint segments, the joints themselves, get those tissues to give and to mobilize. Once you feel like that's loosened up a little bit, then just move the ball up a fraction, even out to the side a little bit more. See where your best position is, where you feel the most restriction, the most tightness, and then compare it to the other side. So again, if you feel like there's any restriction at all, spend some time letting the ball press into there, take the tension out of those joints, take the tension out of some of the muscles in the area, allow those segments to move better. Now, the reason why this is one of the most important exercises for this particular video is that when we're trying to ask the question of why all of these things happen, so why there's some sciatic neural tightness, why your back might be tight, stiffness in the back, as I said, relates to a lot of the sitting habits, but by restricting the low back, we also restrict a lot of the tissues that exit from the back, as in the neural tissues. So if you are standing up and bending over to touch your toes and you basically just hammered by that sciatic nerve tightness, by freeing up the lower back, you should find you can release a lot of those tight handbrakes that you've accrued without realizing it. So again, once you've done that, make sure that you stand up again. We can't forget this. Again, feet shoulder width apart, knees straight, sliding down as far as you feel comfortable. And for me personally, I can now talk to you under my arms. It feels looser than it did before. So obviously for me, I can go a lot further than most people, but even for me, it still feels restricted while I'm doing that. So by getting through these 4 exercises, I'm actually feeling like I'm adding mobility to my tissue straight away. Now, the important thing to tie all this together, as I said before, if you're wearing shoes and socks all the time, if you're sitting down a lot, potentially in a bad shape, there's tangible reasons for why those aspects become dysfunctional or less than perfect in the first place. So if you're someone who has to sit a lot and you value bending down to touch your toes, then obviously try not to sit as much, or if you do have to sit a lot, try and sort of combat that to the best of your ability by doing something like a couch stretch, which again we can link above, that hip capsule stretch that we just went through. Spend some time on a foam roller or a ball, mobilizing that spine, undoing the consequences of sitting and things like that. So those exercises are great to help you bend forwards. Let me know in the comments which one you found was the best. And again, if you find that one is the best, stick to that one a lot, but still come back to those other ones, as well as some strength and stability stuff that we can get to at a later date. But with that being said, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.